Hello, we're glad you joined us tonight. We're going to do something that's an American tradition, tell stories. And our stories are true, and most of you will probably have never heard a single one of them. Storytelling in America existed long before our ancestors came to inhabit this land. Native Americans have been telling and preserving stories for thousands of years. When Africans were cruelly forced to come to this country, they did the same thing so they could maintain memories, even in the most awful times of their history. As the English and Europeans landed on these shores, storytelling around late-night campfires helped make the hardships seem less burdensome as they pushed this country's boundaries ever further west. So, we're going to continue those traditions. We're going to tell you stories. We hope you'll tell them to others. We're not going to use a lot of visual aids. We want you to let your imagination do most of the work. So stay with us as we head toward an old but always new frontier. Oh, one other thing. We believe all stories are better when told at night. You know, we believe that darkness expands the imagination. So all of our stories will be told after the sun goes down. It's late 1863. Now it's well after dark near the train station in Jersey City, New Jersey. Soon Edward, an actor, will step out of the carriage with his close friend John. They're bound from New York to Arlington, Virginia on a business trip. Edwin is not just any actor. He is the most popular actor in America. Imagine the reaction to Brad Pitt and George Clooney together getting on a train in front of a crowd of people, and you will sense how well Edwin was known. The internet, radio, and TV were so far into the future they couldn't even be imagined. But still, with newspapers, billboards, handbills, and marquees, he was one of the most identifiable people in our young nation. This actor, Edwin, had played Hamlet more times than any actor in the world. And this is almost unbelievable. His record still stands. He wasn't the only actor in the family. His father, Junius, was almost as famous as he was. He also had two brothers, John and Junius Jr., that were also recognized as excellent actors. Their father, a vegetarian, who did not believe in even branding animals, also tried to teach his boys that all life is sacred and that not even a housefly should be killed. As the train made its brief stop, Ed and his friend John worked their way toward the platform to board their car. In the meantime, a young man known to his friends as Bobby stepped off the train to stretch his legs. He was en route from Harvard, where he was a student, to Washington to visit his parents. Now, the conductor shouted for some reason they were leaving, and everybody near the crowded train scrambled to get on board. Bobby was standing at the front of the ramp, and everyone gasped as the crush of the crowd knocked him backwards and into a gap between the railway car and the platform. He fell with a thud directly onto the track, stunned. Suddenly people were screaming and shouting because, for reasons never explained, the whistle sounded, the steam bellowed, and the train started moving. Everybody froze for a moment, but then one person, moving with incredible swiftness from the crowd, dropped through the steam, grabbed young Bobby's arm, and literally jerked him from probable death. The train moved only 4 feet before it stopped, leaving the crowd still gasping and shouting. Bobby was safe, and now he was truly alert and excited that he had just been saved by a guy he recognized as the most famous actor in the country. He profusely thanked Ed. Then things calmed down, everyone got back on board, and uneventfully continued south to Virginia. While the rescue clearly seemed significant to Bobby at the time, he apparently never told his parents about it. Now, this may not have been too surprising. He and his father cared for each other, but were not particularly close. His dad, Bobby may have assumed, had enough worries, and also a wife who was very fragile. Now, months later, young Bobby joined the Union force and was assigned as an officer on the staff of General Ulysses S. Grant and stationed at his headquarters right back here in Hopewell, Virginia. He related the incident to an officer also on Grant's staff, Colonel Badeau, who happened to be a friend of the actor Ed. Badeau sent a letter commending him on his heroic life-saving deed. Before receiving the letter, Ed had been completely unaware that the young man whose life he had saved had friends in high places. Now, Badeau's letter to Ed was soon followed by a similar letter from General Ulysses S. Grant himself. You know, Bobby remained on General Grant's staff until the war ended on April the 9th, 1865. And then he accompanied them to Washington on April the 13th to see his parents. The next day, he spent 2 hours with his father, telling him of his great experiences in the Army, which included witnessing Robert E. Lee's surrender at Appomattox Courthouse just the week before. That night, his parents asked him to accompany them to a social event with friends, but he was just too tired and he chose to stay home. A decision he soon came to regret, because several hours later, John Wilkes Booth, the brother of Edwin Booth, the man who saved Bobby, burst into the Ford Theater's presidential box right behind me here and shot Bobby's father, President Abraham Lincoln, in the head as he and his wife, Mary, watched our American cousin. Bobby, formerly known as Robert Todd Lincoln, was beckoned from the White House to the Peterson boarding house across the street from the theater where they had taken his father. And he was with him when he passed away the next morning. Ironically, this theater, Ford's Theater, where this tragedy happened, was owned and named for John Ford, the same John who was with Edwin Booth the night he saved Robert Todd Lincoln. Though Booth did not dwell on his heroic act at the time, in the years after the assassination, it would not only bring him a measure of comfort, but its wide publication would also play a part in rehabilitating the actor's reputation once a cloud had descended over the Booth name. Now, Edwin Booth was a big supporter of President Lincoln and making his brother's assassination of the president all the more devastating. Now, he returned to the stage on January the 3rd, 1866. Once again in the role of Hamlet at the Winter Garden Theater. Not this one, but its predecessor, founded in 1859 and located at 667 Broadway. Reviews of his return performance were unanimous, not only in their praise of his acting, but also for the audience's ecstatic reaction. The New York Times said that when Booth appeared on the stage, the applause extended from the parquet to the dome. Now, there's not a solitary negative reaction to the welcome, which every decent person knew ought to be extended to it. He continued to act for another 25 years, even through an attempt on his life when someone in an audience at a performance in Chicago pulled a gun, fired, and narrowly missed him. Booth passed away in 1893. Lincoln and Booth never corresponded about the incident at the train station, yet both admired each other, and neither one ever forgot it. Since we talked about Robert Lincoln in this tale, I think there are some more interesting and unfortunately not pleasant things you should know about Abraham Lincoln's son Bobby, a good man who had a very successful business and political career. Lee's surrender and his father's death wasn't the only history Robert Lincoln ended up witnessing. By 1881, Robert Todd Lincoln's political lineage and prominence as a lawyer qualified him for a national office, and he became Secretary of War under newly inaugurated James A. Garfield. That July, Robert was scheduled to travel to Elberon, New Jersey with the president, but his trip never happened. Before Lincoln and Garfield's train could leave the station, Charles Godot shot Garfield, who died of complications from the wound 2 months later. Oddly, that wasn't the end of it for the younger Lincoln, though. 2 decades passed without a presidential assassination, but Lincoln's strange luck reared its head again in 1901. He boarded a train to Buffalo at the invitation of President William McKinley to attend the Pan American Exposition. Now, although he arrived a bit late to the event, Lincoln was on his way to meet McKinley when anarchist Leon Zalgiris shot the president twice at close range. After these 3 events of ill-fated destiny, Lincoln decided not to attend any more presidential events. He dryly remarked that there was a certain fatality about the presidential function when I am president. We've heard all our lives that the Titanic was the greatest maritime disaster of all time, with over 1,600 lives lost. We've watched Leo standing on the bow, and we've seen the boat go to the bottom of the sea, carrying its passengers to a cold, dark grave. But there is a story you don't know, and it starts out there in the Mississippi River. It's about a steamboat, the SS Sultana, making its way up the Mississippi from Vicksburg, a port it left 2 days before. The Civil War had just ended, and though some of its passengers are women and children, most are prisoners released from notorious Confederate prisons such as Cahaba and Andersonville, little hells on earth. In Vicksburg, the captain, J.C. Mason, stops passengers from boarding once he reaches the boat's legal 367-person capacity. Soon a Union officer tells him a lie. The officer says that General Grant wants to let the boat be loaded until there's no room for anybody to stand, so former prisoners can get home as soon as possible. Now, what the officer doesn't tell the boat's captain is that the owners of the Sultana have told the Union officer they will pay him a bribe of around $1 per person for every soldier he can get on board. After all, the Union is paying full ticket price for the freed POWs to head upriver and home. Soon, the seriously overloaded boat heads toward Cairo, Illinois, with an unbelievable 2,407 souls on board and 1 grown alligator, a liberated unit's mascot. And as you can tell by the sounds, the men are glad to be headed toward home in delights. They celebrate well into the night. It is now 2:17 a.m., April 27, 1865, and the Sultana's waters have just blown up, and the massive explosion has dumped hundreds of people, some dead and some alive, into the cold Mississippi River. All the lifeboats have been destroyed, and it is a literal flaming hell in the water. And not only that, a fully grown alligator is in the midst of struggling people. It's not pretty. Passing boats and bystanders on both sides of the Mississippi pull survivors from the muddy water. But some of the most poignant stories involve Confederate soldiers rescuing their Union counterparts, like Franklin Hardin Barton of the 23rd Arkansas Cavalry, just trying to make the last few miles to home. His previous assignment was, among other things, finding ships and raiding them that were going up and down the river. A few weeks earlier, he might have been attacking the Sultana if it had steamed past. But now, the war is over and fellow human beings are in the river. It makes no difference that they wear blue. Martin goes to work and tries to get as many as he can out. As soon as he sees the boat explode, he runs here from the campfire shouting to the nearby plantation house, rousing the master. Soon ex-slaves who had been freed but were still living on the plantation were awakened by the commotion. The freed slaves, ex-plantation master, and Confederate officer all worked together, getting dinghies and small fishing boats, even logs, into the water and paddling out to save whom they could, all night long and past sunrise. They rowed out, retrieved bodies and survivors, and brought them to shore. And then they rowed out again. The explosion was heard 8 miles downstream across the river in Memphis. And soon frigates and other boats were headed upriver toward the flames to help. By dawn, a horrible sight is visible as bodies and survivors by the hundreds float past Memphis. Now word spread, and soon every available rowboat was in the river. Confederates joined by Union troops from the other side of the river, pulling to shore what had 2 weeks before been the enemies of one and the friends of another. Soon, all the women of Memphis were showing up at the water's edge with their finest petticoats to be used as bandages and to swathe the dead. A horrible, divisive war might have just ended, but this was about humanity, and people from both sides worked together that night as Americans. When it was over, 500 survivors were pulled from the cold waters they floated past Memphis, and of those, over 300 died in the Memphis hospital. Despite Herculean efforts, 1,800 souls perished the night the Sultana went down, a tragedy greater than the Titanic. You know, you're probably wondering why you never heard about the Sultana, a gripping, dramatic story much bigger than the Titanic. Well, it was the end of the war and only 5 days before Abraham Lincoln had been assassinated. And that took up pretty much all the newspaper space. And on the very day the Sultana sank, John Wilkes Booth, who we've already mentioned in this show, Lincoln's assassin, was run to ground and killed. The Sultana got a 3-line mention in the New York Times and almost nothing anywhere else. The survivors of the Sultana had yearly reunions until 1927, when there were only 4 left. The last survivor died in 1935. A tragic event, but a good example of how we Americans come together when we need to. (1871) was a very dry year in Peshtigo, Wisconsin. There were fires burning all summer and into the fall. Slash and burn agricultural land clearing, the railroads clearing right-of-ways. And nobody put out fires in those days. They just let them burn. In fact, during the week before the fire, the air was so filled with smoke that harbor masters on Lake Michigan blew their foghorns constantly to keep ships from running aground. People saw fire as a good thing. The immigrants were from mostly Nordic countries, and they knew this is how you clear land. Fire was their friend. People were used to fires, even when they got out of control, but no one was prepared for what happened in Peshtigo that day. Northern cold front came sweeping in. The difference in temperature on each side of the cold front was probably 50 degrees, causing raging winds that started fires all over the area. Fires were burning north of here and all the way to Minnesota. Finally, several small fires joined into one big, huge fire outside of Peshtigo. The blazes developed into a firestorm. The heat generated by the burning trees and buildings caused a column of hot air to rise north of town, and cold air rushed in to take its place, fanning the flames. That caused more hot air to rise, and soon the night sky outside Peshtigo was filled with bright flames, producing temperatures estimated at over 600 degrees. Father Peter Pernin, the French Catholic priest in Peshtigo, saw the glow on the horizon about 10 p.m. on October the 8th, 1871. Now he quickly loaded the Holy Eucharist, which Catholics believe is the body of Christ, into a large wagon and began pushing it toward the Peshtigo River. now vocally sounding the alarm for other villagers as he struggled with a heavy wagon. Now soon families are screaming and running with him, all trying to get to the river. All trying to escape a massive fire on both sides of the river. A fire so gigantic it is burning along a 50-mile front. A fire so hot and large that it spawns tornadoes of fire, which whip between the multitudes trying to reach the river. The priest gets the wagon, carrying the Eucharist into the water, and then begins frantically pushing people timidly standing on the bank into the river, realizing it's their only chance of survival. The people of Peshtigo have to stay underwater as much as possible because the fire, seemingly even hotter than the fires of hell, will ignite the air within seconds of coming up for air. The only thing you couldn't hear was people screaming because the sound of the fire tornadoes, the crackling timber, and even lightning made sounds that were enough to burst people's eardrums. It was odd. The fire melted into a lump of iron, the Peshtigo fire engine, but didn't even scorch the paint on the wooden bench 15 feet away. Some people literally burst into flames, while others, only feet away, made it safely to the river. Father Pernin's group watched in horror as a family in a wagon raced toward them, only for everything to burst into flames 50 yards short of the river. Pernin decided to try to get out of the river and help. But as he climbed out the shallow bank, someone shouts, "Father, your clothes and your hair are on fire." Father Pernin quickly scrambles back into the water, and a parishioner asks him if he thinks the world is ending. He says, "No, I do not think so, but it seems the end of the world for us." Now, with air temperatures estimated at 500 to 700 degrees, nobody survived unless they were close to the water. It was the worst natural disaster in the history of the United States. Besides Peshtigo, 12 other communities were completely wiped off the face of the earth. Between 1,500 and 3,000 souls died on this October night. The Peshtigo Fire Museum behind me is where the Peshtigo Catholic Church stood before being destroyed by the flames. But Father Pernin and the Holy Eucharist did survive that horrible night, and now listed as an official miracle in the Catholic Church. So you never heard of the Peshtigo fire? Well, neither have many other people. You see, the same night the Peshtigo fire roared through Wisconsin, Mrs. O'Leary's cow kicked over a lantern here in a Chicago barn and started the well-known Great Chicago Fire that took up all available telegraph and newspaper space. The Peshtigo fire slipped into the forgotten recesses of history. Drawings of Mrs. O'Leary's cow appeared in major newspapers around the country, but not a word about Peshtigo. There's something you should know about that cow. The reporter who said the cow started the fire admitted 3 years later that he was not telling the truth. The Chicago fire might have started in the O'Leary barn, but there was no cow to kick over a lantern. You know, I said Peshtigo was not well documented, but there was a group that studied the fire quite closely. They were U.S. scientists in World War II. They used what had happened here from Peshtigo fire to create the controversial firestorms that rained down and totally destroyed Dresden, Germany, and Tokyo near the end of the war. Now, looking back on it, maybe it's a lesson learned we should just forget.